The detective laughed in the weeping mother's face, hiding evidence that could have brought her child's body home. Hannah read the sentence 3 times, her finger trembling as it traced the indentations where the ballpoint pen had nearly torn through the thin paper of the notebook. The ink was faded, blue turned to gray over 24 years, but the rage embedded in the loops of her mother's handwriting was as fresh as a raw wound. It was a sweltering July afternoon in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the kind of day where the humidity felt like a physical weight pressing against the chest. Hannah Brennan, now 47 years old, sat on the rough wooden floorboards of the attic in the house she had grown up in. The air up here was stagnant, smelling of baked insulation, dust, and the slow decay of a family that had disintegrated long before they had actually died. Below her, the house was silent. The contractors who were renovating the kitchen had left for the day, leaving behind the smell of sawdust and the skeleton of a home being stripped of its memories. Hannah had returned to Bethlehem with a singular, pragmatic goal: empty the house, fix the cosmetic damage of 3 decades of neglect, sell the property, and sever the last tether to the tragedy that had defined her existence. She had successfully avoided this attic for 3 weeks. She had thrown away old clothes, donated furniture, and shredded financial documents with a numb, mechanical efficiency. But the corner under the eaves, stacked with plastic bins labeled in her father's shaky block letters, could no longer be ignored. She had opened the bin marked Patricia Personal, expecting to find knitting patterns or old tax returns. Instead, she found a spiral-bound notebook tucked inside an old shoebox, buried beneath a layer of woolen scarves. The entry was dated October 14, 1997, 6 years after Emily disappeared. Hannah knew the official narrative. Everyone in the Lehigh Valley knew it. Emily Brennan walked into the woods on August 15, 1991, and vanished. The police searched. The volunteers grid the forest. The dogs lost the scent. The case went cold. Her father, Thomas, had retreated into a bottle of whiskey, and her mother, Patricia, had retreated into a prescription drug haze of grief. That was the story Hannah had told herself to survive leaving this town, that her parents were victims who had simply given up. But the notebook in her lap whispered a different story. "I went to the station again today," the entry read. "I told Detective Miller about the man on the logging road. I told him about the red truck the neighbor saw near the property line 2 days before. I begged him to look at Richard Daniels. And he laughed. He actually laughed. He told me I was hysterical. He told me that if I did not stop harassing decent citizens with my delusions, he would have Thomas talk to the doctors about committing me. He sat there with the file on his desk. I saw the edge of a report sticking out and he smiled while I cried. He knows. I know he knows." Hannah felt a cold flush of nausea that had nothing to do with the attic's heat. The image of her mother, small, fragile Patricia Brennan, who always wore cardigans and apologized for taking up space, being mocked by the very people sworn to help her, ignited a spark in Hannah's gut. She looked at the rest of the bin. There were other notebooks, maps, photos of a property line she vaguely recognized. The choice hung in the heavy air, suspended like the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the small window. The realtor was coming in 2 days to take the listing photos. The dumpster in the driveway was half full. Hannah could close this notebook. She could toss it into the heavy-duty black trash bag with the moth-eaten scarves. She could seal the bin, walk down the stairs, sell the house, and return to Philadelphia to her safe, sterile life where Emily was just a picture on a mantle. Doing so would preserve the peace of the dead. It would let her father remain just a sad drunk and her mother just a broken woman. Or she could turn the page. If she turned the page, she was not just cleaning a house anymore. She was acknowledging that the silence of the last 30 years had not been peace. It had been a lie. Hannah reached for the trash bag. Her hand hovered over the plastic. It would be so easy. Just let it go. Let them rest. But the echo of that written laughter clawed at her. He laughed in her face. With a sudden, sharp intake of breath, Hannah shoved the trash bag aside. She grabbed the second notebook from the bin, and then the third. She did not pack them. She opened the first one back up, her eyes devouring the frantic, cramped script of a woman who had been screaming into the void for years. The descent into Patricia Brennan's private hell was not a slow slide. It was a freefall. Hannah spent the next 2 nights not sleeping, but sitting at the newly sanded kitchen table, surrounded by a chaotic spread of 30-year-old obsession. The renovation of the house stalled. When the contractors arrived the next morning, Hannah sent them away, claiming a family emergency. She could not bear the sound of hammers while she was listening to her mother's ghost whisper secrets. The diaries revealed that Patricia had not spent her days in a drug-induced stupor, as Hannah and her father had believed. While Thomas was at the steel plant or the bar, Patricia had been hunting. She had stalked the perimeter of the woods. She had interviewed old ladies who sat on their porches on humid afternoons. She had tracked the movements of a man named Richard Daniels. Hannah remembered Daniels vaguely. He was a wealthy landowner who had property adjacent to the state game lands, about 2 miles from the Brennan backyard. A pillar of the community, a donor to the police benevolent fund, a man who owned a construction company that held half the contracts in the township. The entries were meticulous. August 1993. Daniels paved his driveway 3 days after Emily vanished. Why pave a dirt road that leads to nowhere? September 1994. Spoke to the cashier at the Wawa. She says Daniels came in that Thursday buying bleach and heavy-duty trash bags. Police say this is circumstantial. Miller would not even write it down. July 1996. I found the intersection where the dogs lost the scent. That's exactly where Daniels' old logging road cuts through the creek bed. Why did not they search his barn? As Hannah read, the image of her mother shifted. She was not the weak, weeping figure of Hannah's childhood. She was a detective working without a badge, fueled by a mother's primal instinct. But with every discovery Patricia made, the wall of silence grew taller. The breakdown happened in the winter of 1997. The entries became jagged, the handwriting deteriorating into jagged spikes. This was the period Hannah remembered most vividly from her own teenage years, the time when her mother stopped cooking, stopped cleaning, and started staring at the wall for hours. Hannah had hated her for it. She had hated her mother for giving up. Now, reading the pages, Hannah realized Patricia had not given up. She had been crushed. Miller came to the house today. An entry from December read, Thomas was home. Miller told Thomas that I was harassing Mr. Daniels. He said I was trespassing. He said if I went near the Daniels property again, he'd de-arrest me. Thomas looked at me with such shame. He apologized to Miller. He apologized to the man who is protecting the monster who took our girl. Thomas took my keys away. He says I need to rest. They've locked me in. They've all locked me in. Hannah slammed the notebook shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the empty kitchen. A wave of shame so hot it made her skin prickle washed over her. She had been part of it. She had been 18 then, rolling her eyes at her mother's episodes, siding with her father's exhausted resignation. They had gaslight her into silence. Hannah stood up, pacing the kitchen. Richard Daniels had died in 2015. She had seen his obituary in the local paper, a glowing tribute to a community leader. Detective Miller was likely retired or dead. The case was cold. The file was closed. But the anger was alive. It was a living thing coiling in her chest. She needed to see for herself. She needed to know if her mother had been right, or if these were truly the delusions of a grief-stricken mind. Hannah grabbed her car keys and drove. She did not drive to the police station. She drove to the outskirts of town, to where the suburbs bled into the dense, green wall of the Pennsylvania woods. She turned onto the road where Richard Daniels used to live. The property had been sold, the land subdivided, but the original farmhouse still stood, now derelict, awaiting demolition for a new housing development. She pulled her car onto the shoulder. The woods here were thick, the undergrowth aggressive. This was where the dogs had lost the scent. Hannah stepped out of the car. The humidity was oppressive, just like it had been that day in 1991. She walked toward the tree line, her dress shoes crunching on the gravel. She found the remnants of the old logging road her mother had written about. It was overgrown, choked with briars, but the depression in the earth was still visible. She walked 100 yards in, the shadows of the oak trees lengthening around her. She closed her eyes, trying to feel something. A presence. A sign. "Hey!" The shout made her jump. A police cruiser had pulled up behind her car. A young officer was stepping out, hand resting casually near his belt. "You see not be out here, ma'am," the officer called out. "This is private property. Development company owns it." Hannah walked back toward the road, her heart hammering. "I'm sorry. I grew up near here. I was just looking for memories." The officer's tone was bored, not sympathetic. "We get a lot of that, but you need to move along. No trespassing." Hannah looked at his badge. Officer K. Miller. The name hit her like a physical blow. She looked at his face, the set of the jaw, the eyes. He looked like the man she remembered seeing in the newspaper clippings her mother had hoarded. "Miller," Hannah said, her voice dry. "Are you related to Sergeant Frank Miller?" The officer straightened up, puffing out his chest slightly. "My grandfather, retired as chief. You know him?" Hannah looked from the young, arrogant face of the grandson to the dark, silent woods behind her. The lineage of power, the continuity of silence. Her mother had been crushed by this family. "I knew of him," Hannah said, fighting the urge to scream. "He worked my sister's case. Emily Brennan." The officer's expression did not change. No flicker of recognition, no sympathy. "Right? The cold case. Well, like I said, ma'am. Private property. Move along." He got back in his car and sat there, watching her, waiting for her to leave, just as his grandfather had watched her mother. Hannah got into her car. She did not feel fear anymore. She felt a clarity that was sharp and terrifying. Her mother had not failed. She had been defeated by a system designed to protect its own. And that system was still sitting there in a patrol car watching the woods. As she drove away, Hannah realized she had made a mistake coming here alone. She had shown her hand. She had poked the beast. But she also knew she could not stop. She could not sell the house. Not yet. She drove straight to the Bethlehem Police Department. She was not going to ask for help. She was going to demand the file. The police station had been renovated since 1991, all glass and brushed steel, trying to project transparency. Hannah walked in with her mother's diary clutched in her purse like a weapon. She demanded to speak to whoever was in charge of cold cases. She expected resistance. She expected another Miller. Instead, she was led to a cramped office in the basement, where a man in his 50s sat behind a desk buried under manila folders. Detective Marcus Walsh looked tired. He had the eyes of a man who had seen too much and slept too little. "Emily Brennan," Walsh said, leaning back in his chair after Hannah introduced herself. He did not dismiss her. He did not check his watch. "I know the file. That's one of the heavy ones." "My mother conducted her own investigation," Hannah said, her voice steady. "She kept journals. She identified a suspect, Richard Daniels." Walsh sighed, rubbing his temples. "I've read the notes in the file, Ms. Brennan. Your mother." She was very persistent. But Daniels was cleared. He had an alibi. Verified. "By whom?" Hannah challenged. "2 witnesses. Confirmed he was at a township zoning meeting until 10 p.m. that night." Hannah pulled the diary from her bag. She opened it to a page she had bookmarked with a trembling hand earlier that morning. "Read this," she said, sliding the notebook across the desk. Walsh hesitated, then put on his reading glasses. He read in silence for a long time. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound in the room. "She says here," Walsh said slowly, "that one of the witnesses was a man named Peter Karras, and the other was—" He looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Frank Miller." "The detective on the case was the alibi?" Hannah asked, the air leaving her lungs. "No," Walsh corrected. "Miller was not the alibi. Miller took the statement. The second witness was a councilman named Holloway. But your mother writes here that she saw Miller and Daniels drinking together at the VFW hall 2 days after Emily vanished. She says they were celebrating. She went to Miller with this information, Hannah said, leaning forward, and he laughed at her. He threatened to institutionalize her. Walsh closed the diary. He stood up and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner. He unlocked it with a key from his belt and pulled out a thick, dusty accordion file. He dropped it on the desk. Ms. Brennan, Frank Miller was my training officer 20 years ago. Walsh said quietly. He was a legend in this department. He closed more cases than anyone. Because he framed people, or because he buried the ones he could not solve? Walsh did not answer. He opened the file. He flipped through the yellowed pages, his face unreadable. Then he stopped. He pulled out a carbon copy of a report. This is the alibi statement, Walsh said. He held it up. Signed by Councilman Halloway. Witnessed by Sergeant Miller. But look at the date. Hannah looked. The date of the interview was August 16th, 1991, the day after Emily disappeared. Standard procedure, Walsh said, his voice dropping to a murmur. But look at the timestamp. 8 a.m. They had an alibi for Daniels ready at 8 a.m. the next morning. We did not even know Emily was missing until 8 p.m. the night before. We had not even classified it as a kidnapping yet. We thought she was a runaway. The room spun. Why would they need an alibi for a runaway? Hannah whispered. They would not, Walsh said, his face hardening. Unless they knew she was not coming back. And unless they knew exactly who took her. Walsh looked at the diary again. Your mother wrote that she saw fresh asphalt on Daniel's property. A driveway being paved over. Yes. There's no record in the file of anyone checking that, Walsh said. We have records of searching the woods, the house, the school. But the Daniels property? A black hole. Miller signed off on the grid search, but he deliberately drew the grid to stop 50 yards short of Daniel's fence line. Hannah felt a surge of hope, sharp and painful. Can we search it now? Walsh looked at her, and for a moment, the weary bureaucrat vanished. Richard Daniels is dead. Frank Miller is in a nursing home with dementia. Halloway is in federal prison for embezzlement. The people who protected him are gone. But the land is still there, Hannah said, and the developer is about to tear it up. If we go in there, Walsh said, and we find nothing, I lose my job. Desecrating the property of a deceased local hero, based on the diary of a woman the department labeled unstable? They crucify me. My mother was not unstable, Hannah said, tears finally spilling over. She was right, and they tortured her for it. Walsh looked at the photo of Emily clipped to the front of the file. A girl frozen in time wearing a purple tank top. I need probable cause, Walsh said. The diary is not enough for a warrant. I need something physical. Hannah remembered the entry from 1997. The one about the crank call Patricia had received. The woman whispered something about a trophy. She said he kept things. In the old well. The well, Hannah said. My mother wrote about an old well on the property. She said the caller told her he threw things down there. Walsh flipped through the file. There's no mention of a well on the site maps. Because Miller drew the maps, Hannah said. If the well is there and it was not searched, is that probable cause? Walsh stared at her for a long moment. Then he reached for his phone. If we can find a well that is not on the official police map, it proves the investigation was flawed. Proves omission. He picked up the receiver. I'm calling the geophysics team. We're going to need the ground-penetrating radar. The excavation began 3 days later. The developer threatened to sue, but Walsh had pulled strings, calling in favors from the state police to override the local objections. The site was cordoned off with yellow tape, a sight that attracted the neighbors like vultures. Hannah stood by the perimeter, watching the machinery churn up the earth. It was the same heat, the same oppressive sun as 30 years ago. But this time she was not a child playing with dolls. She was the witness her mother had never been allowed to be. The GPR had found an anomaly. Not a well, the well had been filled in decades ago, but a density variance consistent with a buried structure, capped with concrete. For 2 days they dug. They found old tires, rusted scrap metal, the detritus of a farm. Hannah's hope began to fray. She saw the doubt creeping into Walsh's eyes. She saw the whispers among the crew. Crazy mother, crazy daughter. Then, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, the backhoe hit something that did not sound like dirt or rock. It was a hollow thud. The operator stopped the machine. Men with shovels jumped into the pit. Hannah moved closer, pressing against the tape. Walsh was down there, brushing away dirt. They uncovered a slab of concrete. It was not part of a foundation. It was a haphazard pour, rough and uneven, buried 4 feet deep. "Break it," Walsh ordered. The jackhammer started. The noise was deafening, a violent staccato that shook Hannah's bones. It took an hour to breach the concrete. When they finally broke through, a smell rose from the hole, earthy, stale, but distinct. Walsh shone a flashlight into the void beneath the slab. He froze. He looked up at Hannah. He did not smile. He did not speak. He just took off his cap and placed it on his chest. Hannah ducked under the tape. No one stopped her. She walked to the edge of the pit and looked down. At the bottom of the old, dry well, preserved by the lack of oxygen and the sealing concrete, lay a bundle wrapped in heavy-duty black plastic. But the plastic had torn over time, and visible through the tear was the faded, unmistakable fabric of a purple tank top. Hannah did not scream. She did not collapse. She felt a strange, terrifying calm. They found Emily. But they found more than Emily. As the forensic team carefully extracted the remains, they found a metal box buried with her. Inside, preserved in airtight plastic, were driver's licenses. 4 of them. For girls who had disappeared from 3 different counties between 1985 and 1991. Richard Daniels had not just killed Emily. He had been a predator operating in plain sight for a decade. And Frank Miller, the hero cop, the legend, had known. He had known, and he had buried the truth under concrete and laughter because Daniels was a friend, a donor, a part of the tribe. The news broke that evening. It was not just a local story. It was national. Corruption in Bethlehem. The serial killer protected by police. Hannah sat on the back porch of her parents' house as the sun went down. The house was quiet. The ghosts were still there, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was not heavy anymore. It was light. The coroner had called an hour ago. Positive identification. Emily was coming home. Hannah picked up her mother's diary one last time. She turned to the final entry, the one written just days before Patricia died of heart failure. "I am tired, Hannah. If you ever read this, do not be angry at your father. He was just afraid. I am not afraid anymore. I know where she is. I can feel her. She is close. Someday someone will listen." Hannah took a pen from her pocket. Beneath her mother's final words, she wrote, "I listened. They all listened." She closed the book. Tomorrow, she would go to the nursing home where Frank Miller sat in his wheelchair, staring at a television he could not understand. She would not yell. She would not accuse. She would simply walk into his room, place the newspaper with the headline "Body Found, Police Corruption Exposed" on his lap, and look him in the eye. Even if his mind was gone, she wanted the last thing he saw to be the truth. But for tonight, Hannah watched the fireflies dancing near the tree-line of the woods. The woods were no longer a place of terror. They were just trees. The monster was gone. She breathed in the humid air, finally able to exhale the breath she had been holding for 30 years. She was not just the girl who lost her sister. She was the daughter of Patricia Brennan, the detective who cracked the case. Hannah stood up, went inside, and for the first time in decades, she slept without dreaming.